the situation in the Middle East. The negotiations between Iran and the United States is not direct negotiations. The two sides are sending messages back and forth. At the same time, they're fighting each other. Just last night and the night before, we had the United States and Iran hitting at each other, firing missiles, and some people were killed, some sailors were killed. And Donald Trump at the same time is bragging that how beautiful is the negotiations are happening right now as we talk. What is your understanding of the situation in the Middle East? If you were to mention, let's put it this way, what were the main objectives of the Trump administration with this war in the Middle East, and how many of those objectives have been achieved so far?
I mean, the objectives are really the Israeli objectives, disguised as American objectives. The president's objectives, and he was alone, other than Haig's death, as Max Blumenthal calls him. Everybody else in the room was opposed. The most vocal opponent of going into any kind of regime change war was Vice President J.D. Vance. But Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard had advised against it. Her intelligence report advised that what Bibi Netanyahu was forecasting, which was the regime would collapse in 4 or 5 days, and peace and freedom and liberty would emerge out of Iran in an American Western fashion and model. And Iran couldn't wait to sign up to the Abraham Accords and do America's bidding, Shah style, 1978. And the intelligence report said literally none of that's going to happen. Probably just the opposite. The regime will be more hardline, and there'll be a rally around the flag effect. Joe Kent, head of counterterrorism, advised the same. He'd advised the same the summer before, last summer when this was under consideration and contemplation. Then the Pentagon had advised that it was unlikely to achieve the military objectives that the president was seeking, which at that time was basically the Israeli list, that Iran would have no capacity to have nuclear weapons, that there would be complete regime change in Iran in the way we're discussing, I'm not sure about some of the New York Times stories about certain people being floated. I think that was sort of a belated effort to rationalize some things. It may have been some other insiders who we somehow accidentally killed. But in fact, it was full, complete regime change in a compliant manner, with no ballistic long range or mid range ballistic missile program, with no nuclear enrichment program, with no capacity to be a meaningful threat to Israel, is really what the objective was. Now, for Israel, they would have been fine and would have actually preferred a chaotic, divided, fragmented Iran that looked like Syria, that looked like Libya, that looked like Iraq, that looked like Lebanon, the other places they've gone into over the years, or had America do it for them. But Trump's thought was it'll be regime change, peace and freedom and liberty. Somebody that loves Trump, they'll probably build big golden statues of him in downtown Tehran, like he thinks they're going to do in Venezuela for him, in Caracas sometime soon, like he's doing himself in his own presidential library. If this isn't a sign of somebody losing it, I don't know what is. How many people need to see. So that was the official set of objectives. The unofficially, it was really Israel's objectives, and it was Trump's increasingly diminished decision-making process that is due to what people around the White House described to me all the way back in January as basically early-stage behavioral frontal lobe dementia, which is you lose your sense of empathy. You start to have delusions of grandeur beyond, Trump's always had a healthy ego, but at a whole different level. And to give you some comparisons, first term, you go back to Art of the Deal, other books, he believed that in positive thinking, like he came up with a religious tradition that was about positive thinking, Vincent Peale and all that. But so he said, always expect the best, but also at the same time, plan for the worst. So it was always tethered to this hardcore realism. That Trump used to say, all that's for going to be offered with Middle Eastern war is blood and sand. And all you'll get is a lot of blood trying to fight for a little sand. So he was a deep skeptic of every Middle Eastern conflict going back to the 90s in a range of public statements and comments he'd made over the years. New York Times had a deep dive in part on this in the buildup to the war. All of that is gone. Geopolitical realism is gone. Being tethered to realism is gone. He used to love second opinions. I mean, I was his lawyer for a period of time during the 2020 election. He would seek 50, 55, 60. I mean, there was no limit to the second opinion. It was kind of frustrating at times. Now he doesn't want any second opinions. He doesn't do any contingency planning. He doesn't want, in fact, he doesn't want to hear anything he might even emotionally respond to negatively. His own chief of staff, Susie Wiles, was advising people back in late winter and late fall and early winter, don't share information with the president that he might react negatively to emotionally. So that's how we kind of got there. The Israel lobby figured this out before a lot of other people did. That's why they had Bibi come in February when Vance, by the way, was out of town. He was over in Armenia, in Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus, and that's when they used it because Trump's his declining emotional state, confabulates all the time. He has memento memory. He remembers what he wants, doesn't remember what he doesn't want. He creates a memory that didn't happen. That's why he reinterprets the Iran deal at different times in his way, even though it's not the deal. He convinces himself that it is the deal. That confabulation is probably the worst part of this, but it's not the only negative part to the decision-making process. And he's become obsessed with being this like emperor type figure. That's why he's compared himself to Jesus, compared himself to the Pope, claims he picked the Pope, claims was going to pick the next supreme leader of Iran, says maybe he'll be the next president of Venezuela or maybe the next prime minister of Israel. He hasn't decided yet. This is not normal behavior, even for Trump's relative abnormal first term. You saw none of this in his first term. Viciously attack his longest supporters and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and run them out of Congress. Spend all of his political capital and the Israel lobby's cash to take out Thomas Massie, who is the only real representative of that wing of the Republican Party, the old Ron Paul wing of the Republican Party, but just adding Maha to that equation. And the going after Congresswoman Lauren Boebert. Right now he's advocating en masse for Lindsey Graham, the queen of the war whores, always inviting us into her brothel of blood. Lady Lindsey is now his number one favorite person to talk to every night. When he's not talking every night to Sean Hannity, his main favored sources, like the Pentagon has told him repeatedly that no, in fact, we haven't destroyed 70, 80, 90%. We haven't obliterated their Navy because their real Navy is the boats and the torpedoes and the drones and the little mini subs. We haven't destroyed their Air Force because their Air Force isn't a conventional one. We haven't even actually destroyed their planes either. But is their drones and their missiles built in those missile cities. We haven't destroyed their missile cities. But he convinces himself that we have. They only have a few that can occasionally cause some issues. And that's why he comes up with like crazy plans like Project Freedom, navigation, all the rest, that the Qataris and Saudis had to quash before it got out of hand. His delusional mindset is a continued problem. Haig's death advocates really dumb stuff, but everybody else, General Kane, the Admiral Cooper, other people within the military chain of command, who were not even going to execute on his destroy civilization plan with Iran, and told him so. That they would redefine the list to only be true dual use infrastructure, which is what's legally required, to be illegal, to be just legal under American law, not to mention international standards and whatnot. Not to be a war crime, which is a law in the United States. So he's been advised all those things, but at any given moment, he doesn't want to be Obama. Because he made a huge deal with the JCPOA and pretends things were in the JCPOA that weren't and so forth. But so he's scared of any deal that gives them money, scared of any deal that looks like they can enrich. But at the same time, he's terrified of looking like Jimmy Carter. He doesn't want to look like he doesn't want hostages left behind. So that's where Joe Kent has been very effective, hammering that point over and over and over again. And if you put soldiers on the ground, probably some are going to end up like hostages. You're going to be Jimmy Carter on steroids. He's also terrified of being George W. Bush. He doesn't want to be the guy in a dragged-out, failed war in the Middle East. So the logical thing to do would, of course, be to exit rather than escalate. But I've told people I cannot imagine a deal ever being signed and delivered because Trump is too terrified of the Obama comparison and too deferential to the Israel lobby. At the same time, I can't really see him escalating as long as the Saudis and Qataris are exercising their veto, as long as his own U.S. military and intelligence saying this will backfire against you, as long as the economy is screaming. Deutsche Bank came up with something they call the pressure index. And so follow the 10-year treasury. Once it gets over 4.5, Trump tends to taco. If gas gets over 450, it already is. Trump tends to taco. If his approval ratings drop into the 30s, Trump tends to taco. Well, he's got all three going on at the moment. And his own family is deeply tied in. Kushner and the Witkoffs and Don Jr. and Eric are tied into investments from the various venture capital and other funds they've set up, getting fabulously rich off his second term. He puts any oil monarch to shame. He puts any Latin American tin cup dictator to shame. Puts any Eastern European oligarch to shame. Nobody compares to the amount of Trump has added more money to the family and friends net worth than all of the prior presidents before and after their presidency combined in just a year. Well, a lot of that's tied to the Middle East. What happens if the Saudis are in real trouble? His own personal finances family finances get put into danger. So you have those restraints too. And then China and Russia have been imposing restraints. He really went to China thinking he was going to get China to capitulate, which was mind-boggling. But it gives you an idea where the confabulation that comes from. I mean, they changed Rubio's name because he's banned from coming into China. So they changed it in a way that sounds like Ratio. Yeah, and little Rubio was wearing that little badge around. Look at me, I'm a rat. I'm a rat right there. They had no idea what the symbols meant. I call him Narco Marco because of his family's histories of ties to the cocaine cowboys. That's how Narco Marco family got going financially in the States. Now the Iranian explosive media, those kids that do those Lego videos, they've created a Narco Marco label, which is great. It might not have helped my personal relations with the State Department, but that's another story for another day. So I think there's enough restraint. The incoming midterms, the economic problems, the lack of alliances, the opposition from both China and Russia, the other great powers in the world, that I think escalation is a low risk, but because of his declining mental state, it's never zero.
What does Netanyahu want from Donald Trump? Because every time, you remember when he announced the ceasefire after 39 days of war, right after the announcement of the ceasefire, we had the huge Israeli attack on Lebanon. And as we talk right now, we have the same sort of attacks in Lebanon because Netanyahu, he's not feeling good with an ongoing, it's not a negotiation, ongoing messages between Iran and the United States because they feel maybe something comes out of, these sort of talks. That is not, but Donald Trump did everything for them, in my opinion. This is the ultimate, sort of attempt on the part of the Trump administration to do something for Benjamin Netanyahu. He wanted this war for such a long time, and he got it. And today's Israel is not even comparable to what it was before this war started in terms of militarily, politically, geopolitically. They had, before October the 7th, they had Abraham Accords somehow going on, and that's not there anymore. And there is nothing else for the Trump administration to do for Israel. I don't know why he's insisting on the American presence in the Middle East. Not only Benjamin Netanyahu, we had Lindsey Graham, as you mentioned. Lindsey Graham, he says this is disastrous for Israel if Donald Trump leaves the region with this sort of conditions that we're witnessing right now. And what can he do, in your opinion?
I mean, there's what Bibi should do, but there's one aspect of it that's quasi-religious, another aspect of it that's just geopolitical reality. So taking the geopolitical reality part, small powers surrounded by countries they perceive as hostile or adverse tend to try to parasitically latch on to a great power and get that great power to fight their wars for them. They tend to be expansionistic in their minds as defense. And so it's a risk with any kind of small power like Israel is right out of the gate, just from geopolitical history. The second aspect is the Greater Israel Project that has been an obsession of a certain wing of Zionism, not always the dominant wing, but the current dominant wing of Zionism under Bibi Netanyahu. And they've aligned their Likud party politics in the UK, in Israel, to the U.S. politics and evangelical boomercon politics here in America, which was a marriage of convenience politically made in the late 1970s. But it is dying in the United States. Israel is using up all of its political capital. You see it sort of in that one little race in Kentucky for Thomas Massey. You see it fully displayed. They had to spend more money than they've ever spent before to beat a congressman, and he was 5 points away from winning. Got 45% of the vote. So it took everything they possibly, they were blackmailing a range of groups to keep their mouth shut about Massey. Turning Point, where Charlie Kirk's favorite congressman was Thomas Massey, decided to keep their mouth shut, even take pot shots at him because of the blackmail, extortionate threat, pressure they were under from the Israel lobby. The wide range of other influencers that had long championed, and people like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles at the Daily Wire, they kept their mouths shut, even though Massey was one of their favorite congressmen. So you had a wide range, and then you had all the local political pressure brought. Congresswoman Boebert endorses him, and President Trump threatens her, even though she's his one of his longest standing allies in the House of Representatives. So, but why did they have to do that? Why did they have to expend that degree of political capital in a closed Republican primary, where often a majority of the electorate are boomer cons that were going to be told they have to vote against Massey for Jesus on the Sunday before Election Day? It's because Israel has collapsed amongst every other group in America. They now have a net negative with young evangelical Christians under the age of 50 disapprove of Israel, are more sympathetic to the Palestinians than they are Israel. And then that's amplified times 10 with every other political group in the country. And so given that, they think everything that they ever want to get, they think they got to get now. They think they got to get their Christmas wish, their Hanukkah wish list in quick. Because it's going to be gone maybe in 6 months. The Democrats take the House and the Senate, and Trump is facing a bunch of impeachment. Is he really going to be able to wage a war in Iran in December and January? I don't see it. He'll be lucky to even survive that impeachment. The risk of removal will be high, as his base discovers what Glenn Greenwald recently educated some of them are, which is the scale, scope, and severity of corruption. This is the most corrupt administration, self-enriching administration in American history. And that's saying something if you know about American presidents and politicians. So they make Nancy Pelosi stock trading look like amateur hour by comparison. And so in that context, they know everything they got to get in the next 6 months. That's why he's paranoid of any deal, paranoid of anything that delays this until after the midterms, because he knows that Trump's a dead man walking politically once that happens. Then you have it compounded. You have the Greater Israel Project. You have which has this sort of almost quasi-religious texture to it. You've got this sort of small regional power wanting to expand its borders and and parasitically feed off a great power in order to achieve that, because they can't without it. And then you've got the upcoming midterms that are going to sink the Israel lobby in the U.S. politically. Both parties are going to face major trouble. My preview is in 2028, whichever Democratic candidate is the most anti-Israel candidate, much like the Republican candidate 2016 that was the most anti-immigration was going to get nominated. The Democratic candidate that is perceived as the most anti-Israel candidate will be the next Democratic presidential nominee. So that puts maximum pressure to get as much done as fast now and no delays in the Israeli mindset. And then Bibi's facing election in the fall. And if he doesn't get reelected, he goes to prison for life. Because the corruption scandals, he's found dead to right. So what does he see? He thinks the war can't be perceived as a loss. And any kind of deal will be perceived as a loss, as even Robert Kagan, the neocon champion, has confessed on the public pages of major U.S. publications. And so it'll be seen as surrender. It'll be seen as unnecessary sacrifice. And so Bibi's willing to risk everything. He's willing to risk Israel's own future to save his own hide. Because basically all these projects depend on the Iran war continuing and even escalating between now and November, or Bibi's probably spending the rest of his life in an Israeli prison.
Looking at the situation in the United States, the domestic policy, in your opinion, the negotiation, the way that Donald Trump, we know that he wants to get out of the conflict in the Middle East. He really wants that. But how much of what's going on in his mind is a product of the domestic policy of the United States, and how much of it comes from the reality of the war in the Middle East? It seems to me that he feels that he's trapped in something that is so dangerous, getting so dangerous for him. And because he's losing, you remember when he went to GCC countries and how generous they were in those days to, the way they were communicating with Donald Trump, giving him a lot of money. They had, Qatari government gave him an airplane, and it was amazing what was going on. And right now, those days, it seems that they're feeling so much pain right now in GCC countries because they couldn't sell their oil, their energy, fertilizers, name it. And they have their difficulties right now. They want to get out of this sort of problems they're facing right now. And Donald Trump has his own sort of issues, as you've just mentioned, in terms of domestic policy. But when you compare the domestic issues and the foreign issues for Donald Trump, which one is more important in your opinion?
So a rational Trump would be seeing that the current crisis in Iran is crushing his coalition, dividing it and fracturing it in ways that may be very difficult to recover. And at the same time, sinking the U.S. economy. U.S. consumer sentiment is the most negative it's ever been. If you look at independent voters and working class voters, it's the worst it's ever been with both of those voter groups. That plays into the midterms, where he has the lowest approvals on issues like the economy and cost of living of any president ever polled. That you put it in that context, the rational thing would be to exit as quickly as possible with as minimal long-term harm as possible. Unfortunately, it only sporadically motivates him, even though he knows if he loses the House by substantial margins and loses the Senate, and the more Senate seats he loses, the greater the risk. It's a guarantee he loses the House, he gets impeached. But the greater the risk he actually loses a removal vote, a conviction vote in the Senate, and be the first president ever removed from the presidency. So you would think that that would motivate him, but it only sporadically and erratically does, because his mindset is so focused on Emperor Trump is about to conquer the world. And he convinces himself of these things on a nightly basis. And so his diminished mental state is why you're getting irrational actions, because you're right. And it's rational self-interest. Get the heck out of this. And sporadically, he realizes that. But then it comes back to, I bet if we did this, everything will be great and I'll be a hero again. And he can't get his mind out of that trap. And every night he talks to Sean Hannity every night, talks to Rupert Murdoch often, even though he's suing him, which is ironic. Talks to people like Laura Loomer. I mean, this chick's probably already in a nut house. There's people that think that her fake apartment's probably in the back of a nut house. I mean, just totally crazy. But these are the people that the president of the United States is talking to. But he won't listen to Tulsi Gabbard. He won't listen to Joe Kent. He won't listen to Emerlis Fox, who just left the deputy director of national intelligence, or deputy to the director of national intelligence. Won't listen to Michael Anton, who left the State Department. Won't listen to Elbridge Colby, who's the undersecretary of defense. Won't even listen to Ratcliffe and Rubio when they've warned of problems. Now, Rubio goes back and forth because he wants the Israel lobby to back him in 2028. So he does one thing 1 minute, another thing next minute. Our worst Secretary of State probably ever, Narco Marco. But people praise him as if he's the best. It's mind-boggling. It's a fantasy fake world they live in. But it's the same fantasy fake world that Mark Levin is living in, Lindsey Graham is living in, the Israel lobby in general is living in. It should motivate him, because the more this goes on, the longer this drags on, the more it is guaranteed to sink him in the midterms. I mean, my prediction right now is he would lose 40 or more House seats, and he would lose as many as 10 Senate seats. He would at least lose the Senate, no doubt about that. But that he could lose even more Senate seats that nobody thinks are up for grabs, like Texas, Florida, Nebraska, Montana. Kansas could suddenly show up. Mississippi could suddenly show up being competitive on election night with the way things are trending. And forget about Ohio, Iowa, Maine, and those states, the North Carolina, Michigan, or Georgia they were hoping for. And in that context, he's in serious and severe trouble. But he doesn't consistently recognize it for two reasons: his confabulation and diminished mental state, and the fear people have of giving him negative information due to his temper that he just goes off on him for sharing with them. And then and you can see that. I mean, this is a guy who was willing to let Marjorie Taylor Greene, his longest standing ally in the House, get death threats and tell her it's her fault if her own son dies, because of the death threats the president of the United States had unleashed on her family. So that he is so diminished mentally. And we've had little bits of that, obviously with Joe Biden. Ronald Reagan had, early stage Alzheimer's at the end of his presidency. Woodrow Wilson wasn't even really the president the last 6 months. His wife ran the White House, but not this degree of dangerousness. This is like Dr. Strangelove come to life. We got a few generals that think that way, some apocalyptic mid-range military officials who think they're doing God's bidding to bring Jesus back if they can just bring the apocalypse in. It's terrifying that that's the mindset. Also, you can apply with Trump a lot of confession through projection. Whatever he says about Iran and the negotiations, assume it's what he himself is up to. Who's begging for something? It's Trump, not Iran. Who can't keep their word? It's Trump, not Iran. All of those factors. But his diminished mental state makes it very difficult to do the most and obvious rational option, which is to exit. The main restraint on escalation is still his own Pentagon, his own intelligence agencies, his own vice president, and all of his allies in the Gulf, other than the Emirates, who are just crazy.